Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where it was on this day in 1976 that George Benson's breakthrough album Breezin' hit #1 on the pop charts. And yes, you heard me right. An instrumental jazz fusion album by a guitar virtuoso hit #1 on the US pop charts. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means several things. First of all, it's a wonderful album, cohesive, well written, beautifully performed. You've got one of my favorites, Ronnie Foster, on piano and synthesizer, the wonderful Harvey Mason on drums, Klaus Augerman, one of the great arrangers of the late 20th century, did all of the arrangements for the album. Such a great lineup and so wonderfully well produced, mastered by the great Doug Sachs. It had everything going for it to make it a great album, but it was an instrumental jazz fusion album. And that is not a genre that most people associate with the pop charts. But in the 70s, very interesting things were happening. I would say that in the era of modern recording, no decade has had such a diverse amount of musical hits as did the 70s. Now, there can be arguments that other decades had more diverse experiments in music. One could argue that right now, so many different kinds of music are being fused together that there's a real wide palette of things from which the listener can choose from. But in terms of things that hit the mainstream, it would be hard to argue with the 70s. This was an era when names like Chick Corea and his Return to Forever, John McLaughlin and the Mahavishnu Orchestra, people like Al Di Meola, people, of course, like George Benson, Herbie Hancock, George Duke, people like Billy Cobham. These were names that weren't necessarily household names the way, let's say, the Carpenters were or the Eagles were, but they were selling records. Not as much as some of the huge acts like the Doobie Brothers, but they were selling records, which is something that jazz fusion artists don't do anymore. Just to put this in context, I've got a list in front of me of all of the albums that hit #1 on the US charts in 1976. And it's a really diverse, at least certainly comparatively diverse style of music that we see. So the year begins with Chicago's greatest hits at #1. Is Chicago a jazz fusion band? Are they a prog rock band? They're a bit of both. Then we've got Gratitude by Earth, Wind, and Fire, a funk band, but definitely progressive, very soulful. Then we've got Desire by Bob Dylan, modern folk rock. Then we have Volume 1. Well, back then it was just the only volume of the Eagles' greatest hits. The Eagles were definitely sort of mainstream folk rock, if you will. Some would say sort of Western style rock, but everyone knew who they were. And then, of course, Frampton Comes Alive, which hit #1 several times in that year. Frampton Comes Alive, mainstream rock, but a very virtuosic kind. Peter Frampton is very much a virtuoso. Wings at the Speed of Sound, Paul McCartney, Presence, Led Zeppelin, a great heavy progressive hard rock album. Black and Blue, the Rolling Stones, classic mid 70s Rolling Stones. We've got then Breezin', of course. We've got the self-titled Fleetwood Mac album, the album that introduced the classic lineup featuring Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. And then we end the year with songs in the key of life, what I would call a progressive soul or progressive funk album. So you see a lot of musical diversity. And it was in this mix that jazz fusion really got to get its shot at the mainstream. Now, one of the reasons for this was that a lot of rock music, a lot of pop music, and a lot of mainstream soul and R&B music incorporated elements of jazz fusion. And so the delineation between genres was very much muddied at this time, which I think is a good thing for several reasons. First of all, it allowed more people to gain more exposure to different kinds of music. And second, it helped to break down the barriers that people who are not musicians, but who own record labels and radio stations, it sort of put a knife into their sort of brick wall of, oh, this is this genre, and this audience must like this, and this audience must like this. Now, radio, of course, got more and more corporate over the decades. And that helped to segregate certain styles and even certain ethnic groups into various boxes where there wasn't really a lot of cross pollination. But the mid 70s was still an era where you could hear more than one genre of broadly speaking popular music on AM radio, and FM radio was still pretty much into that free form style, which allowed DJs to say, look, there's only two kinds of music, good and bad. So while Breezen, of course, helped to set in motion an already surging career of George Benson, making him a true legend of guitar who's still going strong, it also helped to prove that an album that isn't made in that typical vocal pop genre can capture the height of the pop charts in an era when you're competing against huge selling albums like Frampton Comes Alive, the Eagles' greatest hits, Fleetwood Mac's self-titled, and so on. So congratulations to George Benson for what you did for yourself and for a genre that I really, really love. And in the 70s, at least, others did as well. Like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.